turn it over to you to kick things off. Thank you.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Steve. So yeah, thank you again for having me. For those that maybe attended an earlier presentation on Tuesday of this week, I gave a brief talk on one of our other products, Microsoft Defender Threat Intelligence. Today's conversation is going to be focused on our other product, Microsoft Defender Enterprise Attack Surface Management, or MDEASM. So I've got some slides to share for today. Let me share my screen. Okay, there we go. So again, my name is Michael Flick. I am a threat intelligence global black belt for Microsoft. With me today, so graciously accepted my invitation to come today, is Sushma Raja, and she is a principal program manager for the MDEASM product. So if there are any questions throughout today's presentation, I think, Steve, that the if the mute all option is still enabled, then please feel free to throw your questions into chat. Sushma will be monitoring the chat and can get back to you on your questions as they come in. At the end of today's session, also more than happy to entertain whatever questions the group may have, and hopefully get into some of the walkthrough for DEASM after the slide deck. And as questions come up around that as well, we will answer them. Okay, so real quick, a little bit about myself. As I said, I'm a TI GBB here at Microsoft. I live in Pittsburgh. I came to Microsoft with the, like Sushma, with the acquisition of RiskIQ last year. So with RiskIQ, I was a solutions architect. Before joining RiskIQ, I served in a number of threat intelligence and vulnerability management roles across the manufacturing and financial sectors, and also did a little bit of time in a position focused on e-commerce fraud analysis. I have BAs in intelligence studies, and Russian studies, and an MS in information security policy management obtained here in Pittsburgh. I do have a family. I've got two young boys, two and a half and 6, who keep me insanely busy. When I do have free time, I live near a trail and do a fair amount of biking. I like to read, and since the start of COVID, I got into mixology. So that's something that I've really enjoyed playing around with recently. So as I said, for today, our focus is going to be on DEASM, and I did come into Microsoft again with the RiskIQ acquisition, and just to touch on that briefly before we get into DEASM, why did Microsoft choose RiskIQ? Well, Microsoft saw an opportunity to create what has ended up being the industry's most complete and relevant threat intel by making that acquisition of RiskIQ. In doing so, Microsoft has, paired RiskIQ's broad internet-focused picture with its own excellent visibility within the firewall. So now that that acquisition is complete, we've been able to launch our new products, Microsoft Defender Threat Intelligence and Microsoft Defender Enterprise Attack Surface Management, and those were launched in August of this year. As I said, today our focus is going to be for DEASM. I'm not sure, well, Steve, the recording was enabled for the DTI presentation, so I'm not sure if that's going to be made available to all the attendees, but if so, I highly suggest. Awesome.
Yeah, it is. Yep. On the
Great,
YouTube channel. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, so I highly suggest that the attendees today, if you have an interest in threat intelligence, please go check that out. There's some great things happening here in Microsoft with threat intelligence since the acquisition of RiskIQ. It's getting better, more accurate, more actionable. So I highly suggest go checking that out. So for those of you that may have been present on Tuesday for a discussion around DTI, just as a quick reminder for those of you that may not have been present, DTI is a tool that gives the user a lens from the seat of a defender out towards the internet. So what we're going to be talking about today with EASM turns that 180 degrees. So now we will be looking at your attack surface from the seat of the threat actor. So with that, our conversation is going to be, focused on what is connected, the attack surface that is connected to the internet, which is dynamic and forever growing. So as I mentioned already, EASM is a platform that offers cybersecurity professionals an outside-in view of the attack surface. So this view starts off with our discovery process. This process uses what we call seeds, which are digital assets like domains, IP blocks, who is contact information, SSL certificates, some other asset types, to begin mapping your organization's externally facing attack surface. So by mapping your attack surface, DASM then enables security and IT teams to identify unknowns, prioritize risks, eliminate threats, so on and so forth. DASM is a tool that is continuously working to discover new assets and monitor those that have been previously discovered, and provides a continuous insight into the attack surface as it changes. So by pairing this continual discovery and monitoring activity with things like vulnerability and infrastructure data, DSM is able to show you an insight into areas that might be of concern. This process addresses a number of challenges that security and IT teams are facing. So to talk about a few of those, rapid digital growth. If you're moving or shifting operations into the cloud, it can be difficult to maintain awareness of all of the assets across a multi-cloud environments. DASM works to discover and monitor all of these assets across something like multi-cloud environments. For vulnerability risk, through the discovery and monitoring process that I mentioned before, DASM is able to identify technologies that might be present on your internet-facing assets. Once those technologies are identified, that data is then paired with vulnerability data to identify vulnerabilities that are potentially affecting your attack surface. Attack surface visibility. So DASM finds assets that your organization may not know about or that may be unmanaged. For example, you have a marketing department that conducts a campaign and uses a previously unapproved provider for that service. Then DASM is going to be able to detect the campaign that may have been set up on a different, previously unknown domain. And then human error. With the rapid digital growth, there are a number of configuration issues that can arise. For example, say I'll pick on physics school. Say a physics school in one of the universities sets up an FTP service on one of their resources while conducting some type of collaboration. That collaboration is over. Once the project is finished, they just forget to disable it. Those are the type of findings that DASM is going to be able to identify and surface within the platform. So to recap, DASM is able to address these challenges using the graph, the Internet Intelligence Graph that we've mapped over the past several years. Those of you who were present on Tuesday's presentation, that Internet Intelligence Graph may trigger a memory. So to cover that briefly, how did we construct this graph? Well, we did so by looking at the internet in the same manner as someone would, a regular user or even attacker. What we do is to build that graph is use a couple of methods. First and foremost, we use web crawlers. This is essentially a virtual user that we point at the internet and then interact with various assets on the internet, web pages, hosts, domains, in the way that a regular user would or an attacker. So what do I mean by that? Making random clicks, examining the document object model, coming from different geolocations, using different browser types, trying to emulate the activity of a user on the internet as closely as we can to gain as much information as we can. We also conduct light scanning of the IPv4 space. That occurs across a number of the most commonly used ports. We also have a number of passive sensors and active sensors. For example, we have a network of passive DNS sensors. So gathering data for passive DNS resolutions and making that available within the internet graph. And then also selected third parties to kind of fill in the gaps of that graph. So now that we've built that internet intelligence graph, how does EASM identify a specific external attack surface within that graph? Well, I think back to one of the earlier slides, I'd mentioned a seed. So at the beginning of the DESM process, the user seeds a workspace. We'll get into the two methodologies that are possible within DESM to seed a workspace once we pivot into the platform. But at its base form, what's happening here is that a domain is used as a seed asset within an attack surface. So from that, we will start to conduct what we call infrastructure chaining and look at the various connections that are made from that domain. So for example, a certain domain has a certain host on that domain. That host resides on an IP address that belongs in the following IP block. That IP block has the following IP addresses, so on and so forth. So in doing so, we're able to develop a more complete picture, more holistic picture of what your attack surface looks like on the internet. So to kind of simplify the process that's happening with MDEASM, we can look at three words: discover, prioritize, and secure. So first and foremost, discover. During the discovery phase, EASM is using the crawlers and sensors mentioned in the slides before to scan the internet in order to build that accurate and up-to-date inventory of your attack surface and the assets that make up that attack surface. Works to understand things like shadow IT and legacy services that might still be online. Once that discovery process is finished, DEASM can identify risks and exposures, like vulnerabilities that are present due to an outdated web component, or maybe even hygiene issues that are related to something like an employee that used a work email address to register a personal website. And then finally, secure. So DEASM highlights these findings and then provides recommendations in order to mitigate those risks and then close the gaps that might exist in your attack surface and improve your overall security posture. As I said, it was a quick slide deck. I'm going to pivot in. I think now's a good time to pivot into the actual UI. I'm going to walk through the creation of a DEASM resource. It's a super quick process. I highly suggest that if the attendees today have the appropriate permissions within Azure, that you test it out. If there's genuine interest in gaining insight into your external attack surface, then this is definitely something that is quick to deploy, easy to use. And we offer a 30-day free trial for you to test the product out. So don't have the, let me pull up the chat here. I didn't see if there were any questions that came through.
There
Okay.
don't seem to be any, Michael.
All righty. Okay, so yeah, still sharing my screen. Good. So if you navigate to, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I jump into this, I have a couple links that I wanted to share with everyone. This first link is, I think this is the first one. Yeah, here we go. This is that is a link that just contains the externally facing short, sweet, to the point bullets about DEASM. I also have a link here that contains the step-by-step instructions on how to deploy a DEASM resource. That is what I'm going to walk through now. And then also this last link is just the link to the documentation that we've made available thus far on how to use EASM as a whole. Okay. So as I said, this is a pretty quick and straightforward process. If you navigate to portal.azure.com and try to, or excuse me, search for Microsoft Defender for EASM. Once it takes you to the DEASM screen, create a resource, select your subscription, pick a resource group, and then name your instance. So this is the high ed. Whoop, no spaces. Select your region. I can dig up a list of the available regions and make sure that I post that in the chat. Apologies, I did not have that in my content to paste into the chat, but I'll make sure that that gets loaded in before the end of today's presentation. And then review and create. It doesn't take long for the resource to deploy. Once it's deployed, we have the opportunity to kick off the discovery process for DEASM. So let's go to the resource. All right. So as I mentioned before, there are two primary methods for creating a DEASM and an attack surface within a deployed DEASM resource. So first, and the most common methodology is to select from one of our pre-created attack surfaces. So all this is a pre-built ASI or attack surface that exists using a number of seeds we previously identified for the entity in question. So for today's purposes and for legal reasons, I'm going to use a demo workspace that was created here at Microsoft. But as I said, if you do have the appropriate permissions to deploy a resource, I highly suggest that you go do this on your own. Select your university or school or organization from the pre-built ASIs, if you so choose, just to see what things look like. So for today's purposes, we can do Contoso. And that's just an organization that, if I spell it correctly, that is used by Microsoft for demo purposes. So all you would have to do is select the entity once it pops up and then click Start Your Attack Surface Discovery. So that's one way, using a pre-built ASI. The second way would be to create a custom attack surface. So all that means is, say if searching for your organization, your school, your organization doesn't yield any results within the pre-built options, then you can come in here, or perhaps you don't like the options or the resulting attack surface that's populated from using a pre-built ASI, then you can come in here and use and build a custom attack surface. So straightforward, exactly as it sounds. You select the seeds that go into constructing your attack surface. For example, domains, IP blocks, hosts, email contacts, ASNs, so on and so forth. can be used to create your attack surface. Another thing that you're going to see here, so we have seeds for inclusion in the asset discovery, but you also have the opportunity to exclude assets from discovery. For example, I am the Threat Intel GBB that is dedicated to supporting the education sector. So I've run into a couple times where, you know, a certain school may want insight into their campus's attack surface, but not so much the rest of the school, the other campuses. So if the domain structure allows, then you can include different schools to make sure that those are not pulled into your attack surface and exclude those from the results. So I'm going to go back and just select the back, do Pentoso. Nope. And let's start it. So when you use a pre-built ASI, you'll be able to see results almost immediately. So we said here, we look up here at the top, our 30-day trial has begun. So if we look down here, we're on the overview tab, and we can see that already we have a couple assets. Again, bear in mind that this is a test workspace, not able to use live data for today's purposes. But if you do choose to deploy on your own, or if I run into you down the road in a more private conversation, then that's something that we can get into and unpack your own attack surface. But for today's conversation, we'll focus on Condoso. So as you can see here, for the overview tab, again, fairly straightforward. It's just an overview of the assets that are making up your attack surface. There are a couple different asset types that we are able to make available within the platform: domains, hosts, pages, SSL certs, ASMs, so on and so forth. The counts that you see here, one domain, 2 hosts, these are all assets that we have found through the discovery process and attributed to confidence. So during the discovery process, we may find other assets that are connected to your attack surface in some way, but perhaps it's not something that you own directly or can have direct control over, but it is related to your attack surface in some way. Common example would be a cloud IP address. You've got a certain application that's hosted on an IP address that belongs to Azure, AWS, GCP, whomever. That IP address, while interesting to you, may not be something that you want regular insight into or to be billed for when the billing occurs. So we have the opportunity, you have the opportunity to change the asset status. You go into the inventory, we can look at the different statuses. Actually, I'm going to pivot over here because I let this one run for a few days being one, to populate some more information, some more data within the demo workspace. So sorry to switch back real quick. After you do kick off the discovery process, the discovery process is ongoing. So while there are back, 1 domain, 2 hosts that are available at the start for the pre-built ASI, that discovery process is going to keep going and then find pages, SSL certs associated with the IPs, or other hosts that are belonging to the your attack surface, populate those into the inventory. So looking at the actual inventory making up the attack surface, we can see that there are a number of assets here. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 pages, a host, 2 hosts, an IP, and a domain. So thinking about those asset statuses that I was talking about, So say we have an asset that's, or excuse me, this IP address is a cloud IP and was pulled into inventory and something that we don't want that regular insight into. Everything that you see here in this view is going to be in what we call approved inventory. So that is, as a reminder, something that we were able to attribute to your organization with a high degree of confidence. You own it, it belongs to you, you have direct control over it. We can modify those assets to a number of different asset status types. So again, approved is what everything in inventory defaults to, but we also have candidate, dependency, monitor only, and requires investigation. I won't give an explanation for each status type, but perhaps focusing in on one. A dependency would be that example of a cloud IP, something that you care about, you want insight, you may want some insight into, but you don't necessarily have direct control over it and don't want to build for it. So you move that into a dependency and that'll take it out of your approved inventory. Some of these others are fairly self-explanatory, but like I said, I won't waste time going over explanations for each one. So this is the inventory view. Again, fairly straightforward, just a raw view into the assets that make up the approved assets in approved inventory that make up your attack surface. If we pivot into one of these assets, then you're going to get a more drilled down view into the information that we're able to obtain for the assets we identify for your attack surface. So at the top, you'll see the state of the asset that you drilled into, approved, when it was added to inventory, when it was last updated, when we first saw it, when we last saw it, and some other information, other bits of information, who is, so name servers, contact information, where we're able to get it and it's not privacy protected. We look over on the right-hand side, there's a bit more information. The overview tab is going to show a breakdown of CV information that we're able to identify, any web components that we may have been able to detect associated with that particular asset. Services, same with services, and one of the most interesting pieces is the discovery chain. So if ever there's a question of, well, this is great, I have access into this or insight into this asset, and EASM says it's part of my attack surface. Well, how is it a part of my attack surface? That this discovery chain section is going to be the area where where EASM shows you how that connection was made. So we started with the seed domain or IP, contact information, whatever it might be, and then the steps that happen, the hops that happened to make the connection to the asset that you're looking at. So we see here, it's a fairly straightforward one. Contoso.org has a host of www.contoso.org. There are a number of other tabs that provide deeper insight into services, trackers, web components, resources, SSL, and a more complete view of the who is information associated with the asset in question. If we go back to the home screen here, then looking down on the right-hand side, you'll see that there are a number of dashboards. So these dashboards are pre-baked into every deployment of every resource of EASM, and they're meant to give the quick insight into what might be wrong with my attack surface. Where might I have some vulnerabilities? Where might I have opportunities for hygiene cleanup? Those types of findings. So we'll take a look at the attack surface summary dashboard first. So looking at the attack surface summary dashboard, the first couple widgets up here towards the top are going to be related to attack surface priorities. So think back to the slide deck when I was speaking about the discovery process. So during the discovery process, we are able to identify certain web components that are present on assets within your attack surface. So as we identify these web components, these technologies that are present on your assets, we're able to then, once that information has been identified, pair that with vulnerability information. So say a certain version of WordPress is vulnerable to CVEs X, Y, and Z. We're able to make those findings, able to surface those findings within these attack surface priority widgets for you to review. So recognizing that all three of these are reading 0, not necessarily, again, demo workspace, but even if they are 0, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if there's anything new that pops up in the world, a new vulnerability, then those vulnerabilities, those articles will be populated into these priorities, high, medium, low. And any asset that belongs to your attack surface potentially affected by those CVEs are going to populate here. You would see, instead of 0, you would see the count of the affected assets in your attack surface. Composition, again, pretty straightforward there. Securing the cloud. So I know that there aren't any resolutions showing up, or findings that are showing up in the securing the cloud section, but we talked briefly already about the transition to the cloud, the use of multi-cloud environment. So for example, this widget is potentially very useful for identifying issues there. Somebody that is using only Azure and AWS for their cloud hosting providers would maybe find assets that are hosted in DigitalOcean to be suspect. Those are some of the findings that would be surfaced in this widget. Perhaps a different department went off and is conducting their own project and using DigitalOcean as the hosting provider. So that's the type of stuff that's going to be surfaced in this securing the cloud widget. Sensitive services, things like FTP, SSH, things of that nature are going to be highlighted in this widget. So if we are able to identify those services on one of the assets belonging in your attack surface, those are going to be highlighted here for you to drill down into. Same with SSL certificate expiration and domain expiration. If you have a dedicated crypto team, or your infrastructure team in general, takes care of these responsibilities, then this is great information to present to those teams to close those security gaps related to, an SSL certificate expiring or preventing a threat actor from scooping up a domain that is about to expire. Pivoting into another of the dashboards, the pre-baked dashboards that are available in EASM. Security posture. Some of the things that are going to be found in security posture: CV exposure, domain administration. Again, some of these fall more in the line of hygiene. If your university or school has a policy that domains that are registered in the name of the university must adhere to the following policy, using this registrar, registered in this way, then this widget can provide insight into, well, why do we have more than one registrar? Why do we have more than one registrant? Let's dig into those results and see if there are assets that aren't adhering to the policies that we've had set up. Hosting and networking, domains configuration, similar findings, similar results. Open ports, similar to the sensitive services, but a little bit more broad. Same with SSL configuration and organization. Any of the details about specific SSL certificates that exist on your assets within your attack surface are going to be highlighted in these widgets: SSL config and organization. I won't go through the specific details for GDPR compliance in the OWASP top 10, but suffice to say that each dashboard relates to highlighting data within your attack surface as it relates to GDPR compliance in the OWASP top 10. Quickly, GDPR compliance, looking at things that might have exposed might have opportunities for exposed PII, assets that are capturing login information, those types of findings are going to be surfaced within the GDPR compliance dashboard. And then again, straightforward OWASP top 10. It's going to run down through the OWASP top 10 and how it relates to the assets within your attack surface. So at this point, I don't know if we can, unmute everybody and open it up to questions, Steve, but I feel like this would probably be a good time to open it up to the wider group if there are any questions. Something that I may have touched on but didn't go too far in depth into that the attendees would like to learn more about. I'm happy to entertain that now.
Yep. That is done. So everybody has the ability to come off mute. And if you want to turn your camera on at the same time, you can do that as well. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, I have a quick question. Thanks for the presentation. Great stuff. I may have glossed over this, but how do you bring in the host into this platform to be able to scan against your external surface? Or is it just completely external and you don't even need our host?
Yeah, so great question. You have the opportunity to give us, to give DEASM the hosts. But during that discovery process, if we use, myuniversity.com, then any host that exists on myuniversity.com is going to be pulled in by DEASM through that crawling, through that scanning process. And Jesse, you're sorry to kind of keep going down this. I don't think this is directly related to your question, but hearing the scanning term again made me think of this, and it might preempt one of the questions that that the group has. So when we say scanning, I just want it to be abundantly clear that we are not DEASM is not a traditional vulnerability scanner. DEASM is not going to be testing forms. We are not going to be validating inputs. That is not something that DEASM is going to do. It is all the scanning and interacting that happens with DEASM is done in a very passive manner.
Hey, Michael, can I add a little bit to that?
Please.
Yeah, I'm glad that you clarified the scanning part of it, because that is a common misconception. But from the host piece of it, I think the original question, we'll typically ask a user for a seed, and a seed is really one asset piece of information that you already know about yourself. So usually our customers will give us either a host, a domain, an IP address, something that they already know that they own. And from there, we've already graphed kind of the entire internet. We're going to now run kind of queries, pulling everything that is related to that seed or that one piece of input that you gave us, pulling everything from there. What Michael showed you was that we also have an inventory of about 50, 60,000 organizations that we've already identified their seeds or that piece of information that we already know belongs to you. And so we've already run that inventory and that across our discovery graph, our internet graph already. And so we have that information already pulled.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Yeah, it sounds much like OWASP AMAS scans that they do. They pull up passively. So great. All right. Thank you.
And one thing while people ask, thinking about additional questions to ask, I did put a link in the chat window to a form. If you can, please give us some feedback on what you thought about the presentation. And if you want anybody to follow up with you, go ahead and put your email address in that form as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Steve. That's definitely one of the things that I was going to address before we closed out today was do not hesitate to use that form. If you even want to shoot me an email directly, I'm here. I will absolutely be happy to have a conversation around DEASM. Again, if you have the permissions and the time to go ahead and deploy a resource and play around with DEASM, I highly suggest that you do. There's a lot of great information that can be gleaned from the tool once it's done doing its initial discovery process. Thanks, Steve, for throwing that in there.
Yeah, and Greg's got a couple questions too. So
yeah. Oh, awesome. All right, Greg.
Michael, you may take this question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yes, there are restrictions in terms of the region that we can deploy. We currently are deployed in 6 regions, and I'm not going to try to rattle them off from memory. We are actively looking into additional regions as well, but we are covered globally in the 6 regions that we have. But I know that there are customer requirements for additional ones as well. And then is the initial part of the information similar to what's offered in Shodan? Shodan does offer a similar type of information or similar type of mapping of your attack surface. What Shodan doesn't go into heavy detail on is the individual components of each asset. So they do some level of mapping of the attack surface, but they won't go into all of your vulnerabilities, your security posture to the depth that we do today.
Go ahead, just come off mute there, Greg.
All right, yeah. So I'll follow up on that. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
So essentially this, I guess the idea is, I know in different sectors people rely kind of on that, not to kind of cast it completely aside, but the idea is essentially this is that information plus a whole lot of enrichment that comes from other signals or other things that we can make available to enrich what's coming into that external surface. But it's kind of a similar thing. It's that outside looking in type of view to identify perhaps some of
Correct. Yeah.
your most egregious things and then drilling in deeper. Okay.
Absolutely. One of the customers that we recently spoke to kind of equated this, also brought up Shodan and also equated this that, you know, what we're giving is kind of that, not just that cursory level, but now we're actually giving you that detail level that would take them, I think they said around 80 hours in order to find this type of information on their own. It is open source information, so it is public information. You could find it, but it would take them a significant amount of time to be able to correlate this and present it all back to that level of detail.
No, and having this also perhaps act as part of your overall posture recommendations and having it integrated into the platform along with everything else is there. You know, obviously, it's somewhat to me an obvious advantage. And thank you for listing the regions, because I just want to make sure we're deploying into the right ones with that, because I think just making sure that we don't, if deploying it, it gives us what we need. Because sometimes just deploying into a resource group or instance, you have all the options available, you know, but want to make sure we pick the right ones. Thank you for that.
Sure.
All right. If there's no additional questions, one last call for questions. If not, I will go ahead and turn the recording off. And thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to Shishma and to Michael for presenting. You guys are awesome.